I'll give you another example. I remember when a woman came to me, and she was in a deep state of despair. And I asked her, how long has this despair been with you? And she says, almost as long as I can remember. And I asked her, when did it begin? What age do you remember when despair really became a very potent and powerful part of your experience? And she told me of this story where she was laying in bed and she was crying out for her mother. And her mother never came, and she kept crying and crying and crying and crying and crying, and her mother never came. Now, she was about 6 years old at the time. And as she laid there, her mind started to feel like she had been abandoned. This is something that's quite common for young children. When we're very young and we are experiencing anxiety or suffering or sadness or just confusion, we'll cry out. And sometimes we'll conclude, if we don't get our emotional need of the moment met, we'll make certain conclusions about life. Little stories will start to get formed. We won't even know they're happening. It might be a story like, my mother hates me. She doesn't care about me. I never get what I really want. And of course, like all stories, they'll seem very, very true. So when I was talking to this particular woman, her story was that she was abandoned and that she really never got what she needed from her mother. And as I encouraged her to tell her story, she just kept telling it and telling it and telling it. And when she had kind of finished, I said, okay, now that you've told the story, now that you've gotten in touch with the voice of your suffering, we're going to use the voice of your suffering to really free yourself. And so I encouraged her to look back and to really begin to question the first conclusion that her mind had formed around this event. I was abandoned when I really needed my mother most. And I asked her to keep telling herself that story. I said, just in this moment, tell yourself that story and see how you feel. And she told herself the story. I was abandoned when I needed my mother most. And I said, what happens inside of you? What do you feel when you tell the story? And of course she said she felt abandoned and despair and sorrow. And I said, now tell yourself the story again and again, a few more times. And I was doing this just so her body and her mind could really begin to associate the fact that this conclusion in her mind was maintaining this very potent and powerful experience. After she said it for a couple of times, then I asked her a question that she didn't really expect. I said, is this story of what happened really true? Is your conclusion really accurate? And the first thing she said is, yes, I was abandoned and I needed my mother and I never really did get what I wanted. And once again I asked her, what happens when you tell yourself that and believe it? And she said, well, I feel the despair again. I feel abandonment again. I feel this great, great sadness. And I said, okay, remember that event. Because we're not denying that anything that ever happened. We're not trying to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I said, what I want you to do is to see if you can remember that event, but for just a moment, not to tell yourself any story, not to make any conclusions about your mother or life or abandonment or anything, but just experience it wordlessly. And I could see as she closed her eyes, she had a memory of what happened. And she went over the memory in her mind, and I could see it happening because I could see the way she held her face and her posture began to change. And then she opened her eyes. And she says, when I remembered the story, without telling myself anything, without making any conclusion, without blaming or telling myself that I didn't get what I needed, I actually felt better. But she said, my story seems so true. I didn't get what I needed. It did cause me sorrow. I have felt this deep pain ever since. And I asked her once again, experience the same memory, but withhold your story, withhold your conclusions your mind had made. Don't judge yourself for making them, but just see if you can experience a story without them. And once again, she closed her eyes and imagined what had happened. And then she opened her eyes. And I said, before you tell yourself a story about it, what's the experience now? And she said, it's just a memory now. It's just like an event that happened, but it's not triggering any feeling in me. And it was at that moment when she began to realize this link between her mind and her body, between her emotional life and her thinking life. And she began to see that when those two become linked, when our minds do what they do, they explain events, they give justifications, they tell ourselves stories about what happened and whether it should or shouldn't have. And we believe those. We think that those stories are true, and in some way we think they're justified and they'll help us out. But really, when you begin to see how this whole phenomenon works, you'll very much begin to see that thought and feeling work in conjunction with one another. And almost always, those moments of deep-seated pain and suffering that stay with us for a whole lifetime sometimes are actually held in place by our unconscious conclusions that we made at the moment. And it's important to see that whatever conclusions we made about a painful moment, whether it was a child or whether it was in our adult life when someone left us, or we came down with an illness and lost our job, and maybe got kicked out of our home, or whatever the moment that brought pain, that when you can begin to separate the conclusions your mind came to, given the experience you had, that it begins to open a space within you where the emotion can come out in such a way that it doesn't have to repeat itself over and over and over. Because there's a principle in suffering, and it's important to understand it. It has to do with the painful emotions that keep regenerating themselves in our systems and go on year after year after year. And the principle is this: any experience we've had where we weren't able to remain fully conscious, where we in some way went into a coping strategy, and usually that coping strategy had something to do with our mind. Our mind began to think about it and tell us a story, and usually that story is frightening and terrifying and scary. And we did this quite naturally, because our minds are meant to try to explain events. They're storytellers. And when we experience deep suffering, deep painful emotions, our mind will immediately and sometimes frantically start telling itself a story. Start trying to construct a scenario that will explain why we feel the way we feel. But as our minds do this, we actually go more and more unconscious. And by unconscious, I mean we don't really experience what happened in a completely full and open way, that we contract and pull away from the experience, which is actually quite normal. Nobody wants to feel bad, so it seems quite natural to contract and pull away. But any experience that we've contracted from, that our mind has begun to spin a story around, these are ways that our body and mind has caused us to go unconscious. And as soon as we go unconscious, whatever the emotion that happened at that time will be locked into our system. It will stay there and regenerate itself and repeat itself over and over and over until we find the capacity to experience that emotion without going unconscious in any way. And so when I ask people to speak to me from the emotion, it's so that they can begin to hear the story that helped them to go unconscious. Even though our stories about what happened may seem very, very justified, the important thing to remember is that they really cause us to go unconscious and lock suffering into our system, into our biology. So really, what we need to do is to find the capacity to feel what we feel without creating more thought about it. And when you start to have a feeling, and maybe it's associated with a memory, as you replay that memory in your head, if you don't tell yourself something about it, if you withhold conclusions, you start to feel like the emotion starts to release itself from your system. It may not do this immediately. In fact, it may cause you to feel the experience of suffering more and more deeply, more intensely. But this is only because you're experiencing it now in a conscious way, not in a numbed way or a disassociated way. But you've become very intimate with the moment-to-moment experience that you're having. Our bodies are very well adapted to purge themselves of suffering. When we cry, when we weep, it's actually a way that our bodies are trying to purify us, trying to wipe from our systems painful and toxic emotions. Tears are a way that our body literally carries the toxins of emotions out of our system. But while our body is often trying to help us to let go of suffering, to relieve us of it, to purge it out of our system, our mind is doing the opposite. It's re-traumatizing ourselves with its story and its conclusions. And the deceptive thing is, whatever conclusions we've made about painful moments in our life will seem very, very justified. There'll be ample proof for why your mind's version of what happened is very, very real. And not just real, but necessary. So when you begin to feel some really powerful emotion, see if you can hear the viewpoint that your mind created about it, without judgment, hesitation, or denial. You might need to write it down, otherwise it might seem too chaotic. But once you do, then you can invite yourself to experience the same thing without the story. Don't worry, the story it'll be there if you want to go back to it. But it's a way that your body begins to feel the difference between a raw, pure emotion and an emotion that is held in place and maintained through the story of it. There was another gentleman several years ago that told me about another painful emotion that he had. And I asked him to speak to me from the emotion, to tell me how the emotion felt about himself or the world or others. And he looked inside and he said, Adya, I can't find any story. And I said, there is one. He said, I really can't find it. So I invited him to just be with it over the next week or two and come back to me and tell me how it's gone. A few weeks later, I met him again at a speaking engagement that I was doing. And we talked about his suffering. And what he told me was, after he had really sat with it for about a week on and off, and he was really looking for the story, he said, the reason that I couldn't really hear the story of my suffering, that I couldn't hear the viewpoint of my suffering, was because I was keeping myself apart from it, like the witness of it. And I said, yes, you have to relinquish the witnessing of it. And he said he had realized that, and once he had relinquished watching it, he said all of a sudden the story began to come out. And he just let it out, and he let it out, and he let it out, and he let it out. And through that process, he began to see that it was this combination of feeling and thought that had locked it in his system. And when he actually let both of them out, and begin to let the intellectual or thought-based part of the story go, the emotion lifted all by itself, and he was quite surprised. It can be quite extraordinary.